The early morning hustle at Atlanta International Airport was in full swing as Dr. Michelle Carter made her way through the terminal, her carry-on rolling smoothly behind her. She'd just wrapped up a 16-hour surgery that had kept her on her feet all night, but you wouldn't know it from her composed demeanor. Her neat blazer and pressed slacks spoke of the professionalism she carried everywhere, even on a cross-country flight. The boarding area for Flight 2317 to Los Angeles was packed with the usual mix of business travelers tapping away on laptops and families trying to keep their kids entertained. Dr. Carter couldn't help but smile as she watched a little boy, no more than 5, explaining to his stuffed dinosaur how airplanes stay up in the sky. She'd chosen this early flight specifically to catch up on some much-needed rest. The past week had been intense. 3 complex brain surgeries, each one more challenging than the last. But that's what she loved about her job. Each procedure was a puzzle, each patient unique, and each successful outcome a reminder of why she'd spent 12 years of her life pursuing her medical degree. As the gate agent called for first-class boarding, Dr. Carter gathered her things. Her colleague had insisted on upgrading her ticket as a thank you for covering his shifts during a family emergency. "You deserve it," he'd said, and for once she didn't argue. After being on her feet for so long, the thought of extra legroom was too tempting to refuse. Walking down the jet bridge, she could already feel the tension in her shoulders starting to ease. The familiar smell of airplane cabin and the quiet hum of the ventilation system greeted her as she stepped aboard. The flight attendant at the door, a friendly-looking man with laugh lines around his eyes, checked her boarding pass and gestured toward the left. "Welcome aboard, Dr. Carter. You're in 2A, just past the galley on your left." The first-class cabin was everything she'd hoped for: spacious seats, soft lighting, and the promise of peaceful hours ahead. She stored her small carry-on in the overhead bin, keeping only her tablet and a medical journal she'd been meaning to read for weeks. The leather seat felt like heaven as she sank into it, adjusting the headrest to the perfect height. Dr. Carter pulled out her tablet, opening a research paper on innovative treatments for pediatric brain tumors. She'd been corresponding with colleagues in Boston about a promising new approach, and this quiet time would be perfect for reviewing their latest findings. As she settled in, other passengers began filtering past her to their seats, the usual parade of briefcases and weekend bags. The cabin slowly filled with the soft murmur of conversations and the clicking of seatbelts. Dr. Carter was just getting absorbed in her reading when she felt it, that subtle shift in the atmosphere that signals something's about to happen. She glanced up from her tablet just as a shadow fell across her seat. She had no way of knowing that the next few minutes would turn her peaceful morning flight into something entirely unexpected. The woman standing in the aisle, clutching a designer handbag and wearing an expression of barely contained indignation, was about to transform this routine journey into a story that would be shared thousands of times across social media. But for now, Dr. Carter simply looked up, her finger marking her place on the tablet screen, waiting to see what the woman wanted. After 20 years of practicing medicine, she'd learned to trust her instincts. And right now, those instincts were telling her this wasn't going to be a simple case of a mixed-up seat assignment. The gentle hum of the aircraft's systems continued in the background, the boarding music played softly overhead, and in that moment, suspended between peace and chaos, Dr. Carter took a deep breath. Years of handling high-pressure situations in the operating room had taught her to stay calm in the face of unexpected challenges. She was about to need every bit of that professional composure. The woman hovering over Dr. Carter's seat adjusted her designer sunglasses, pushing them up into her perfectly highlighted hair. Everything about her screamed expensive taste, from her pristine white blazer to her manicured nails clutching a leather wallet. But it was her expression, a mixture of disbelief and barely contained anger, that caught Dr. Carter's attention. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice carrying that particular tone that suggested she wasn't actually trying to be polite at all. "I think you're in my seat." She waved her boarding pass in the air without actually showing it to Dr. Carter. "This is first class, and I always book 2A always." Dr. Carter had dealt with enough difficult situations in her career to know that staying calm was crucial. She offered a professional smile and reached for her own boarding pass. "I understand there might be some confusion. Let me just show you my ticket." No, the woman cut her off, her voice rising slightly. "There's no confusion. I specifically requested this seat. I fly this route twice a month. She leaned in closer, lowering her voice to a stage whisper that somehow managed to be even more condescending than her normal tone. I think you must have gotten turned around during boarding. Economy class is through those curtains behind us. A few nearby passengers stopped their own conversations, turning to watch the scene unfold. Dr. Carter could feel their eyes on her, but she maintained her composure. 20 years of performing delicate brain surgery had taught her the value of staying steady under pressure. "Ma'am," Dr. Carter began again, her voice calm and clear, "I have my boarding pass right here." She held up her phone, displaying the electronic ticket with seat 2A clearly marked. As you can see, the woman barely glanced at the screen before waving it away. "Oh no, there must be some sort of computer error. These things happen all the time with the booking system." She snapped her fingers in the air, trying to get a flight attendant's attention. "We'll just need to get this sorted out quickly. The plane needs to take off on time, and I have an important meeting in Los Angeles." Dr. Carter took a deep breath, remembering the countless times she'd had to maintain her professional demeanor in challenging situations. She'd faced worried families, dealt with complex medical emergencies, and handled high-pressure decisions in the operating room. This, by comparison, should have been simple. "I understand you're a frequent flyer," Dr. Carter said, keeping her voice steady, "but I assure you, this is my assigned seat. I'd be happy to show my ticket to a flight attendant to clear up any confusion." A businessman across the aisle had lowered his newspaper, watching the interaction with poorly concealed interest. A couple in the row behind had stopped their conversation mid-sentence. Even the little boy with the dinosaur toy from the gate area, now settling into economy class with his mother, peeked through the gap between seats to watch the growing tension in first class. The woman's face flushed slightly as she noticed the attention they were drawing. Rather than backing down, however, she seemed to grow more determined. "Listen," she said, leaning in close enough that Dr. Carter could smell her expensive perfume, "there's clearly been a mistake. I don't mean to be difficult, but this is my seat. I'm sure the airline can find you a nice spot in economy. They usually leave a few open for situations like this." The implications in her tone were impossible to miss. Dr. Carter felt a familiar weight settle in her chest, the same one she'd felt countless times throughout her medical career when someone assumed she was a nurse, or when patients requested to speak to the actual doctor even after she'd introduced herself. Just then, a gentle chime sounded through the cabin, signaling the final boarding call. The woman straightened up, adjusting her blazer with an air of someone used to getting her way. "We really should get this sorted quickly," she said loudly, finally succeeding in catching a flight attendant's eye. "I'm sure none of us want to delay the flight." As the flight attendant made his way toward them, Dr. Carter remained seated, her hand resting calmly on her tablet. She'd spent years earning her position, her credentials, and yes, this first-class seat. The woman might have been a frequent flyer, but Dr. Carter was about to demonstrate a different kind of experience, the kind that comes from facing down prejudice with dignity and determination. The cabin's atmosphere had grown thick with tension, and other passengers were now openly watching the scene unfold. Some had even pulled out their phones, sensing that this confrontation was about to become something worth documenting. The woman's demands were about to backfire in a way she couldn't possibly expect, and the next few moments would transform this simple seating dispute into a viral lesson about assumptions and respect. The flight attendant, James, had been watching the situation unfold from the galley while preparing the pre-flight refreshments. With over 15 years of experience, he'd seen his fair share of seating disputes, but something about this one felt different. As he approached, he noticed how the first-class cabin had gone oddly quiet, with most passengers either openly staring or pretending very hard not to notice what was happening. "Is there something I can help with?" James asked, his voice carrying that perfect blend of authority and courtesy that comes from years of handling difficult situations at 35,000 feet. He'd noticed Dr. Carter when she first boarded. Her calm demeanor and professional appearance had stood out, making this confrontation all the more surprising. The woman in the aisle immediately turned to him, her designer handbag swinging with the motion. "Yes, finally. There's been a mix-up with the seating arrangements." She gestured toward Dr. Carter as if she were pointing out a misplaced piece of luggage. I always sit in 2A. I'm a platinum member, and I specifically request this seat for my bi-monthly Los Angeles trips. James nodded professionally, though his eyes flickered briefly to Dr. Carter, who remained remarkably composed. I understand. May I see both of your boarding passes, please? Dr. Carter quietly held up her phone, displaying her electronic ticket. The other woman rummaged through her handbag, pulling out a slightly crumpled paper boarding pass with an air of triumph. As James carefully reviewed both documents, a young woman in row 3 had her phone discreetly pointed toward the scene, recording. Two businessmen across the aisle exchanged knowing looks, having witnessed similar situations before. The tension in the cabin was palpable. "Ma'am," James said, addressing the standing woman, "I see here that your assigned seat is actually 32F. He turned the paper boarding pass toward her, pointing to the clearly printed seat number. Dr. Carter is correctly seated in 2A. The woman's face flushed a deeper shade of red. That's impossible. There must be some mistake. Check again. She leaned in closer to look at her boarding pass, as if the numbers might magically rearrange themselves. I'm a platinum member. I always sit in first class. I understand your confusion, James replied diplomatically, but I can confirm that Dr. Carter's ticket is for seat 2A. However, I'd be happy to help you locate your assigned seat in the main cabin. A few snickers could be heard from nearby passengers. Someone coughed in a way that sounded suspiciously like karma. The woman's hands began to shake slightly as she gripped her designer bag tighter. This is ridiculous, she sputtered. I demand to speak to the head flight attendant. I've never been so insulted in my life. Do you know how much money I spend with this airline every year? James straightened his posture slightly, his name badge catching the cabin light. Ma'am, I am the lead flight attendant on this flight. And I need to ask you to lower your voice. We have other passengers trying to get settled. The woman glanced around, suddenly seeming to realize that nearly every passenger in first class was watching the scene unfold. Some had removed their AirPods. Others had set aside their magazines. One passenger was hiding a smile behind his coffee cup. But she faltered, her voice slightly less certain now. There has to be some sort of priority upgrade system. I'm sure we can work something out. She attempted a conspiratorial smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Perhaps we could check if there are any other first-class passengers who might be willing to switch. Dr. Carter, who had remained silent throughout this exchange, finally spoke up. Her voice was clear and professional, the same tone she used when explaining complex procedures to her medical students. I'm quite comfortable in my assigned seat, thank you, and I believe we're approaching departure time. James nodded in agreement. That's correct. Ma'am, he turned back to the standing woman. I need to ask you to proceed to your assigned seat now. We're beginning our final preparations for takeoff. The woman's mouth opened and closed several times, like a fish out of water. The phones recording the incident remained steady, capturing every moment of her internal struggle between pride and the increasing realization that she had no ground to stand on, literally or figuratively. Just then, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. Flight crew, please prepare for departure. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. James gestured politely but firmly toward the back of the plane. Please allow me to assist you with finding you a seat, ma'am. We don't want to delay our departure. The woman looked around one last time, perhaps hoping to find some support among the other passengers. Instead, she was met with raised eyebrows and barely concealed smirks. Even the little boy with the dinosaur toy was peeking through the seats again, wide-eyed at the adult drama unfolding before him. As James prepared to escort her to the main cabin, the situation was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would make this incident go viral for reasons nobody in the cabin could have anticipated. Just as James was about to escort the woman to economy class, a gentle but firm voice spoke up from seat 1B. Excuse me, but I couldn't help overhearing. The speaker was an elderly gentleman in a well-worn cardigan, his silver hair neatly combed, and his eyes bright with recognition as he turned around to face the group. Young lady, he addressed the standing woman, though his warm smile was directed at Dr. Carter. Do you know who you're asking to move? He didn't wait for an answer. This doctor, this brilliant surgeon, saved my grandson's life 6 months ago. The cabin grew even quieter, if that was possible. The woman's hand froze on her designer handbag strap. Dr. Carter looked up, surprised, as the gentleman continued. My grandson Tommy was just 8 years old, he said, his voice thick with emotion. 3 other hospitals told us his brain tumor was inoperable. They told us to prepare for the worst. He paused, taking off his glasses to wipe them with a handkerchief. But Dr. Carter didn't just give us hope, she gave us a miracle. The elderly man turned fully in his seat now, addressing the entire first-class cabin. She spent 14 hours in surgery. 14 hours. When other doctors said it couldn't be done, she found a way. She didn't just remove the tumor, she gave my Tommy his future back. Dr. Carter's professional composure softened slightly. Mr. Chen, she said quietly, you don't need to. Oh, but I do, he insisted, reaching into his wallet and pulling out a photo. Look, he said, holding it up for everyone to see. This is Tommy at his baseball game last weekend, playing shortstop, making diving catches, living a normal life that we thought he'd never have. The photo made its way around the first-class cabin, a beaming young boy in a baseball uniform, no visible sign of his past medical battles. Passengers passed it carefully from one to another, many of them nodding with newfound understanding. The woman who had been so insistent about the seat now stood awkwardly in the aisle, her face a mix of emotions. Her earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by visible discomfort as Mr. Chen continued his story. Do you know what Dr. Carter did after the surgery? He asked, though it was clearly a rhetorical question. She spent an hour explaining everything to our family, drawing diagrams, answering questions, making sure we understood every detail of Tommy's recovery plan. And then she gave us her personal number in case we had any concerns during his recovery. A woman in row 3 wiped a tear from her eye. The businessman who had been pretending to read his newspaper was now fully engaged in the story. Even the flight attendant, James, stood respectfully listening, his earlier urgency about takeoff temporarily forgotten. Last month, Mr. Chen continued, his voice growing stronger. Tommy's school had a career day. You know what he dressed up as? He smiled broadly. A neurosurgeon. He told his whole class about the amazing doctor who fixed his brain and made him better. He reached into his carry-on bag and pulled out a child's drawing, clearly done by Tommy, showing a figure in blue scrubs with the words "My Hero" written in crayon across the top. He asked me to give this to you next time I saw you, Dr. Carter. I was going to mail it to your office, but it seems fate had other plans. The standing woman's face had gone from red to pale. She shifted her weight from one expensive shoe to the other, likely wishing she could disappear into the airplane's carpet. The phones recording the scene hadn't lowered. If anything, more had joined them. So, Mr. Chen concluded, turning to face the woman directly, if you're wondering whether Dr. Carter belongs in first class, I can assure you, she deserves this seat more than any of us. She's not just a doctor, she's a guardian angel to families like mine. The silence that followed was profound. Several passengers nodded in agreement. Others looked at Dr. Carter with newfound respect. The woman who had caused the entire scene stood frozen, her boarding pass crumpled in her hand as the full weight of her assumptions and actions crashed down around her. Dr. Carter, ever professional, simply said, "Thank you, Mr. Chen. Tommy is one of my favorite patients. I'm so glad to hear he's doing well." She paused, then added with a gentle smile, "Please tell him I love the drawing." The whole cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see how the woman would respond to this unexpected turn of events. The story of her demands and assumptions was about to spread far beyond this flight, becoming a powerful reminder about judging others without knowing their story. The aftermath of Mr. Chen's revelation rippled through the cabin like a wave. The woman who had caused such a scene stood rooted to the spot, her designer handbag hanging limply at her side. Her face had cycled through various shades of red and was now settling on a mortified pale. I didn't know, she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. The confidence and entitlement that had fueled her earlier demands had completely evaporated. A businesswoman in row 4 cleared her throat. "None of us ever know someone's story when we first meet them," she said. "That's why it's important not to make assumptions." She turned to face the standing woman directly. "Last month, someone assumed I was a secretary at my own company. I'm the CEO." This opened the floodgates. Other passengers began sharing their own experiences. Someone once told me I was in the wrong waiting room because they didn't believe I was a professor, called out a voice from row 3. I've been teaching quantum physics for 20 years. I get it all the time at my architecture firm, another passenger added. People always assume I'm the interior decorator, not the lead architect. James, the flight attendant, stepped forward again. His voice was professional but firm. Ma'am, I need to escort you to your assigned seat now. We're already behind schedule for takeoff. The woman looked around the cabin one last time, perhaps hoping to find a sympathetic face, but was met with raised eyebrows and disapproving looks. Even the little boy with the dinosaur toy, still peeking through the seats from economy class, seemed to understand that something important had just happened. Actually, a man in a business suit spoke up. I'd like to speak to the cabin supervisor about this incident. I've been recording it, and as a platinum member myself, I don't think this behavior represents the values of this airline. Several other passengers nodded in agreement, their phones still capturing every moment. The woman's eyes widened as she realized just how many people had documented her behavior. I have the supervisor's attention already, James replied calmly. Now, ma'am, your seat is this way. He gestured toward economy class, maintaining his professional demeanor despite the situation. As they began walking toward the back of the plane, something unexpected happened. Dr. Carter spoke up, her voice carrying the same compassionate tone she likely used with nervous patients. We all have moments we wish we could take back, she said quietly. What matters is what we learn from them. The woman paused mid-step, her shoulders tense. For a moment, it seemed she might say something more, but instead, she simply nodded and continued following James to her assigned seat. As they disappeared behind the curtain separating the cabins, the first-class section burst into quiet conversation. Passengers leaned across aisles to discuss what they'd witnessed, many still shaking their heads in disbelief. I'm sending this video to my daughter, one passenger said. She's in medical school, and she needs to see that these kinds of situations still happen, but also how to handle them with grace. Mr. Chen turned back to Dr. Carter. I'm sorry if I embarrassed you by sharing Tommy's story, he said, but some things need to be said out loud. Dr. Carter smiled warmly. No need to apologize. How about you show me more recent photos of Tommy? I'd love to see how he's doing. The atmosphere in first class had completely transformed. What had started as a tense confrontation had become a moment of connection and understanding. Passengers who had been strangers minutes ago were now sharing their own stories, exchanging contact information, and discussing how to use this experience to create positive change. From the back of the plane, the sound of shuffling and murmured conversations suggested that the story was already spreading throughout the economy cabin. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, completing their pre-flight checks, but even they couldn't help sharing knowing looks as they passed seat 2A. The captain's voice came over the intercom again. Flight attendants, please prepare for takeoff. As the plane began to push back from the gate, several passengers were still typing furiously on their phones, sharing what they'd witnessed with friends and family. This story was about to reach far beyond the confines of Flight 2317, becoming a powerful reminder about respect, assumptions, and the importance of seeing beyond surface judgments. Samantha took a deep breath as she sank into the plush leather of her first-class airline seat. The successful business owner rarely indulged in such luxuries, but after nailing her latest deal, she figured she deserved a treat. As the plane filled with passengers, a middle-aged white woman stopped abruptly at Samantha's row. The woman's face twisted into a scowl as she looked down her nose at Samantha. "Excuse me, I think you're in the wrong place," the woman said loudly, placing her hands on her hips. "This is first class." Samantha held up her ticket with a polite smile. "Yes, I know. Seat 3A, that's me." The woman, whose name Samantha later learned was Karen, snatched the ticket from her hand. She examined it closely, as if trying to detect a forgery, before thrusting it back with a huff. "Well, we'll just see about that," Karen declared as she marched off to find a flight attendant. Samantha shook her head in disbelief. She had dealt with her share of discrimination over the years, but the blatant audacity of this woman was stunning. A few minutes later, Karen returned with a young flight attendant in tow. The attendant's customer service smile faltered slightly as Karen jabbed a finger toward Samantha. "This woman is in the wrong seat. You need to move her to coach immediately," Karen demanded. The flight attendant glanced at Samantha's ticket, then back at Karen. "Ma'am, the ticket shows that she is in the correct assigned seat. Now please take your seat so we can finish boarding and depart on time." Karen's face reddened as she clenched her fists at her sides. "This is unacceptable. I paid good money for first class and I won't sit next to some scammer who snuck in here." By this point, the other first-class passengers were staring openly at the unfolding drama. Samantha felt their eyes on her, but kept her composure, back straight and chin up. She would not let this woman diminish her. The attendant's voice hardened. "Ma'am, you are delaying the flight. Please sit down. Now." For a moment it looked like Karen might actually explode, but realizing she was out of options, she turned on her heel and stormed to her seat in the last row, angrily shoving her designer handbag into the overhead bin. As the plane took off, Samantha tried to lose herself in some work on her laptop, but she could feel Karen's glare boring into the back of her head from 3 rows back. Every few minutes, Samantha heard her muttering loudly to their fellow passengers. "No idea how she got up here. Probably stole someone's ticket. You can't trust their kind, you know." An older gentleman across the aisle caught Samantha's eye. The pity on his face bothered her even more than Karen's blatant animosity. Samantha felt her nails digging into her palms and took a steadying breath. She had to stay above it all. Getting upset was exactly the reaction Karen wanted. About halfway through the 2-hour flight, Samantha's nerves were worn thin by Karen's constant stream of loud, passive-aggressive insults. As she got up to use the restroom and stretch her legs, Karen saw her chance. Bounding from her seat, Karen slid past Samantha. And as she did, she casually tipped her plastic airline cup full of red wine directly onto Samantha's lap and open laptop. The dark purple liquid splattered everywhere as Samantha gasped in shock. Her light silk blouse was drenched, as was her expensive leather laptop bag. "Oops, how clumsy of me," Karen said, her voice dripping with fake concern that didn't match the smug smirk on her face. Samantha leaped up as the wine seeped into her clothes and bag. Rage boiled inside her, but she fought back the urge to scream. 2 flight attendants came running at the sound of the commotion. When they saw the scene, they quickly ushered Samantha to the bathroom to clean up as best she could. "I don't know what that woman's problem is, but we saw what happened," one attendant said as she blotted Samantha's blouse with club soda. "The captain has been informed and is contacting ground control now." As they emerged from the restroom, Samantha saw Karen gloating in her seat, not a hint of remorse on her face. But the gloating quickly morphed into outrage as the pilot came on the loudspeaker. "This is your captain speaking. We have an unruly passenger situation in the first-class cabin. As a result, we will have authorities meeting the aircraft upon arrival. Flight attendants, please ensure all passengers return to and remain in their assigned seats with seatbelts securely fastened. Thank you." Karen began sputtering and gesticulating wildly at the news, but a quick glance around showed all the other passengers glaring at her with a mix of anger and disgust. She finally sat down, crossing her arms in indignation. The rest of the flight passed tensely but uneventfully. Upon landing, 2 police officers entered the plane and made a beeline for Karen. Her protestations of innocence fell on deaf ears as they escorted her off the aircraft to a smattering of applause from the other passengers. An airline representative met Samantha at the gate, profusely apologizing for the incident. They assured her that her ruined personal belongings would be replaced and that Karen would be banned from the airline for life. Still somewhat in shock, Samantha made her way to the terminal. As she was walking, a young woman approached her tentatively. "Excuse me, are you the woman from the incident on the flight? The one with that awful racist lady?" Surprised, Samantha could only nod. The woman smiled at her. "I just wanted to say thank you for handling that with such grace. I've been in similar situations, and I know how hard it can be to keep your cool. You're an inspiration." Touched, Samantha thanked her. She barely made it to her Uber before the tears began to flow. Her emotions were a jumble of anger, pride, frustration, and gratefulness. That night, Samantha shared her story on social media, tagging the airline. She wasn't sure what to expect, but felt compelled to speak out. To her amazement, the post went viral. Hundreds of people from all walks of life shared similar stories of harassment and discrimination during their travels. The airline publicly responded, thanking Samantha for bringing the incident to light. They announced plans to review and enhance their diversity training for all employees. Suddenly, Samantha found herself at the center of a nationwide conversation about the daily injustices faced by people of color. In the following weeks, Samantha used her newfound platform to amplify the voices of others and push for real change. She partnered with civil rights organizations to raise awareness and lobby for stronger protections against discrimination in travel and public accommodations. For so long, Samantha had focused solely on quietly excelling, letting her work ethic and achievements speak for themselves. But she now realized the importance of speaking out, even in the face of discomfort. Change only happens when those with privilege are forced to confront the ugly realities that others deal with daily. Looking back, Samantha knows that fateful flight was a defining moment. It ignited a fire within her to fight injustice that would continue to burn for years to come. And it reminded her of the true meaning of courage, integrity, and standing up for what's right even when, especially when, it's the difficult thing to do.